Thank you very much, Emily, and thank you to all the organizers of the I was going to say the Handmaid's Tale. Okay, well, we did have a little wine with dinner. A hand assembly, which has been incredible to be part of, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Okay, I'm gonna just set a timer here because I know everyone wants to do karaoke soon. Story is one of the integral ways that Indigenous and non-Indigenous ways of knowing are passed from generation to generation. For many cultures, visual stories aid the oral. I'm thinking about winter counts, patterns and designs, birch bark scrolls, quilts that Lisa Binkley spoke about the other night, drawings, photos, and even memes these days, as examples of visual articulations that reinforce and contain stories. I want to begin tonight by introducing myself by telling a story about a story. This is my art project. Aren't I a great artist? Sorry. So on the left, far left, you'll see my great-grandmother, and her name was, believe it or not, Seeing Red. And it was odd because I didn't know her name. I knew her mother's name was Wâhkôhtowin, which also means holy face. And next to her is my grandmother, Jean, and my daughter, Dagmar, my eldest, my mother, Colette, and Madeline, my youngest daughter. I'm not in the thing. I figured I'm here. That's good enough. So, although I'm a research chair at Carleton, I'm really a visitor to that territory as I am a visitor to this territory tonight. And I'd like to thank the original keepers that Emily already mentioned. I'm from the Qu'Appelle Valley in Saskatchewan. It's Treaty 4 land. And my family, though, came to be part of that place through both settler immigration in the 19th century from Pictou County, and before that from the Scottish Highlands, and also as a displaced Indigenous people fleeing the US government after the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. I'm a mix of Scots, French, Lakota, Métis, Heinz 57 identities, and I've spent much of my childhood, however, with my mom's family, and especially my Lakota grandmother. And so I've been shaped in many ways by her Indigenous ways, though I also carry my Scots and French heritages proudly. One day, while I was sifting through the archives at the Moose Jaw Art Gallery, looking for material related to a collector of Indigenous beadwork, I came across a written transcription of an oral story, and it accompanied the donation of a Lakota dress that was on display at the museum. The story explains that the woman who sewed the dress crossed the medicine line in 1877 with Sitting Bull and his followers, my family, who camped near what is today Wood Mountain First Nation, the only Lakota reserve in Canada, actually, but also in Saskatchewan. Followers of Sitting Bull were resistant to settlement on US reservations and were following him, and subsequently migrated to Canada after the battle when George Custer and his 7th Cavalry were killed on the battlefield. Families under the direction of Hunkpapa leader Tatanka Oyate sought sanctuary in Canada, protection against the impending retaliation of the US cavalry. And as a form of passage, my great-grandmother's family carried with them medals given to Lakota warriors' ancestors who fought with the British in the 7 Years' War. They viewed those medals as precious historical items that were a form of passport for safe haven to Canada. Whether Canadian officials saw the medals that way, I'm not really sure, but at least for the short term, the government agreed to offer them a place to camp, and although they were closely monitored by the newly created Northwest Mounted Police at Fort Walsh. I'd often looked at this dress in a display case at the museum, but I hadn't really thought much about it. I was hurrying to get to an art opening or to see the contemporary holdings of beadwork in the archives. My research, after all, is really unrelated to older items. Yet, when I was digging through these archives to working on an essay, I stumbled across the transcription of the oral story about the dress, and I paused, and I thought about the power of what was before me. The story of this dress, its biography is, in many ways, the story of my matriarchal family. I asked the archivist to remove the plexiglass top, and I took this photo. Saichia, or the Lakota notion of adorning oneself in traditional fashion in a way that pleases not only the relations of the earth, but also of the spirit world, helped me to understand the power of the dress, whose story I was straining to listen to. I am still straining to listen to. In an aesthetic sense, the precious adornment of this garment speaks to its complex relationship in an interconnected world. The archival photograph that I've paired with this image of what the dress usually looks like near kind of a creepy diorama in the museum is a photograph of Annie Eagle Elk, and it's a good example to show what the dress would have looked like if it was being worn. And you see here that Annie Eagle Elk has an elk bone breastplate, ornate earrings, plaited hair, and beautifully adorned moccasins. I would argue that this dress has had a hard time telling me about its life, partly because it was sealed inside this large plexiglass vitrine, but also partly too because I was severed from my Lakota culture and language and sealed off from the knowledge and stories needed to fully appreciate the nuanced narratives contained within it. Yet this dress has much to say about the past, the present, and I think the future as well. And as such, I'm going to try to share what I know so far before I move on to a larger discussion about storying. The dress was made by a woman named Tatanka, also known as Mrs. Big Bull. She's the wife of Tatanka Oyate, sorry, I can't say anything now, who was Sikanju or Brule, potentially even Yanktonai Dakota, it's really not sure, but he was known as Black Bull. There are many stories about her husband, Joe Black Bull. He fought in the Northwest Rebellion, for example, on the side of Louis Riel. And this couple stayed in the Moose Jaw area after Sitting Bull returned to the United States, and the dress remained with Tatanka until her death, when she gifted it to Annie Smith Wallace in exchange for a proper burial. This is Annie Smith Wallace that you see here, and Wallace donated 192 pieces of mostly Lakota art to the Moose Jaw Museum upon her death in 1962. And that's why the dress is there, and that's also why this beautiful trivet that you see here is in the collection. It is an example of commodity art that was made at the time. So museum collections are often divorced from the lives of the objects that they preserve and prize, as Lisa explained in relation to quilts on Thursday. Mostly beadwork in institutional collections has little or no information about the maker, and it's the information about the donor, collector, that typically provides some context. And that adds to the story of this dress. So Smith Wallace moved to Moose Jaw with her family as a young girl in the 1880s, during a time when the railroad was coming through. But unlike most young girls on the prairie, she became friends and allies with the camped Lakota people in the Wâhkôhtowin Valley on the shores of the Moose Jaw River next to the town. She learned to speak Lakota. She became close friends with the community, especially with Tasanaskawin, and eventually the community formally adopted her in the Hunka ceremony and gave her the name Iaskawin, the interpreter. The dress was part of the gifts to Annie Wallace in exchange for her ensuring that upon her death in 1910, that Wallace would pay for her friend's burial. And of course she did. And today, now I'm getting it all mixed up. Tasanaskawin's headstone is part of the city's historic tour as the first Indigenous person buried in the Moose Jaw Cemetery. And this is an example of reciprocity, which is one of the elements of Indigenous ways of knowing. This is a photo of Annie. She used to set up in the hotel in Moose Jaw with all of her collected items. And you can see sort of up behind her, the dress is hanging on a hanger there. So the story states that during the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Black Bull took one of the Gideons or flags of the 7th Cavalry and gave it to his wife to sew into a dress. This dress then would be imbued with the power of that historical battle victory. Sadly, I've examined the dress very closely and I've never found any evidence of the flag per se. But it is possible that she inserted small elements of it into it, but also there's a very strange thing. In the sleeves of this dress, you see 2 lines which are not on the dress in the museum collection. So it's possible that they were removed by Annie Smith Wallace before she donated those to the museum. So one of the amazing aspects of this dress that you see here, I'm going to go to the next one, sorry, are the 12 rows of dentalium shells that grace the yoke. These shells, of course, are not from the prairies, yet they were often used on dresses because of the symbolic association to water and to the creation story of the Lakota. To put your head through the hole of the yoke symbolically enacts the process of being born from water and connects to that creation story. The shells here also demonstrate a long intertribal system of trade that took place across Turtle Island in order to facilitate the making of such a garment as this. We often think about trade as a system of exchange related to contact with Europeans, traders, but such roots are much, much older. And if you know of Pueblo Bonito, for example, in the Four Corners region of the American Southwest, where there have been archaeological digs that have found Great Lakes copper, Florida crocodile teeth, and quetzal feathers from the Amazon, you know that it was a hub of exchange and activity. These particular dentalium shells probably came from Oregon or Washington, but we don't know how I'm getting this all mixed up now, Tasanaskawin, received the shells. Makers long traded for materials for adornment in order to make their most precious of garments and ceremonial regalia. So this dress is also made from Stroud cloth. It's a wool trade cloth that is part of that European trade tradition, and it had become ubiquitous among Plains women for making dresses at this time because it was very difficult to get access to hides and tan hides when they were on the move. We also see ribbon and some beadwork on this dress. Sorry about the quality of these kind of awful iPhone photographs, but I wanted to show you some of these details. You see the ribbon along the bottom. There's the 4 colors of the medicine wheel. The long elongated beads at one time were always all the 4 directions, but in between them you see that little circular beaded piece with the 3 sprouts above. That's a prairie turnip. And prairie turnips were feeding the community at that time. And so they were considered to be really important, sort of spiritually and nourishing people at a time when it was difficult to find food. So those are on here as well, which I thought was kind of interesting. So imagine sewing a dress like this when you've just crossed the border, you're living in uncertain times, the buffalo are almost gone, food is sparse, and the pressure from the US government meant that you were going to be assigned to a reservation when you returned across the border. The dress remains imbued with power, but it's also shrouded in secret, and I'm working with a Lakota elder in hopes that I can learn more about the dress's story in the future. While I was working on this story of the dress, another sort of odd thing happened to me. I was at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, and I found this hand-drawn map. It was misfiled in a file, and it just fell out onto the table. And it also connects my family to the dress and to the story of that movement into Canada. And so I just thought I would show you that today because serendipity is helping to tell this story. I include the term storying in the title of my talk. I like it because it relates to the action of telling a story or stories. Key for me in this definition is the word action. I do believe that through the process of making, story is activated, actionable, an active agent. Story isn't a complacent or passive object in this way of thinking. And I'm referring mostly to the process of sewing and beading in this case, and of storying at that time. But I don't want you to think about the noun story, but of the verb of story. Storying integrates with the process of making or something involved in a relational activation between living beings writ large in space and time that pull from the past, shape our present, and in the best of cases, I think, transform our future. The beading circle, for example, is similar to the quilting circles or sewing circles that we know of that gather people together and serve as a catalyst for storying. So Indigenous knowledge keepers mostly use oral stories to transmit ways of knowing inherent in specific cultural contexts. But I do want to stress that though that storytelling cannot be separated out from other ways of knowing. So connections to land in the fullest sense of a relational meaning, in the reason we do the land acknowledgement, remains an integral part of storying. And Cree or Niihau Métis elder Maria Campbell, who's from Saskatchewan, is a well-known author, storyteller, TV producer, and knowledge keeper from Saskatchewan, who not only understands the feelings for land, for relations, she puts them eloquently into words, something that's hard for most people to fully grasp. And I quote Maria here, "The land doesn't speak out loud. The environment doesn't speak out loud. It talks to you in other ways. And that's what's important. So there's a whole other language that sometimes isn't spoken that you have between you and the connection to the land. You don't have to own that land. You don't have to speak the language to have a connection to that land." So I want you to keep that in your mind as we're going through this talk. So this is a trivet, another trivet that is beaded by a prairie woman at a time in the early 20th century when it was needed to sell items for extra food. And it is a work like the round Lakota one I showed you earlier that not only is pleasing to the eye of settler women who were collecting these and using when they had tea in their own kitchens, but also it still transmits traditional knowledge. So those indigenous ways of knowing are involved in that. So the dress informs my larger project of research around prairie beading aesthetics and my thinking around knowledge transmission and storying on the flatland. So this talk is part of an ongoing investigation into the works of contemporary beaders mostly, and what the role of intergenerational knowledge transmission and story plays in those practices. So colonialism has severed many of what would be naturalized ways of learning how to work with porcupine quills, a sacred gift to Lakota women from the white buffalo woman. But although glass trade beads arrived in eastern North America shortly after European contact, it really wasn't until the 1820s that glass beads came to the prairie. So they were called pony beads because they arrived packed on the backs of ponies in the upper Missouri Basin on the plains, and they sparked an amazing period of experimentation, innovation, and technological change for indigenous makers in this region. And anthropologist Marcia Bowl notes that by the end of the 19th century, the Lakota living in this territory were, quote, extremely prolific producers of art, even under such profound changed circumstances, end quote. Think about that dress when you think this. And lots of people jokingly say on the prairie that Lakota women, if you sat down too long, they would just bead you. They found it so easy compared to quill work. So indigenous beaders, I would argue, hold a sensorial bond to place that translates through the process of making, manifested in the beaded works, and influenced by these new and changing technologies. The movement of the needle and thread, the creation of the design, the choice of colors, the mathematical skill required, demanded keen performative attention that both quiets but also opens the mind. And so a key aspect of the beading practice on the plains refers to generational sharing of technologies and knowledge. So with a break in traditional ways of teaching and learning, I wondered how contemporary beaders were dealing with this. So this is a photograph just from UAC in Quebec City in October, and these are some of my beading gang. And so on the far right is Judy Anderson, Cree artist Judy Anderson. Next to her is Ruth Cuthand. Next to her in the very middle is Kathy Mattis, and she's a Métis curator and prof from Brandon. That's me. And then in the amazing red jumpsuit is Catherine Boyer. Okay, so through our discussion, so I started to ask them this: how were you learning beadwork, and how did you deal with intergenerational knowledge transmission? And so it all kind of started with Ruth Cuthand, who's second from the right, and she's who we call our Queen Bead. Ruth learned from elders, from community members, from books, and by looking. Judy Anderson learned from Ruth, and Catherine learned from Judy. These three generations of contemporary artists and beaders formed their own lineage of knowledge, mobility, and transmission. This is an installation shot of Ruth Cuthand's trading series that was on display at the Plug-in Gallery in 2014. You might be familiar with Ruth's work since it's in the collections of the Art Gallery of Ontario, the National Gallery of Canada, the Whitney Museum, and many, many other places. I think she's probably the only artist, Indigenous artist, to have had a solo show at the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. Yes, she beads diseases, and she's into it. She came to teach beading as a teacher working at First Nations University of Canada as a studio instructor. And she had to think about ways to teach beading to students, and she began to then bead as part of her contemporary practice. I've known Ruth for years. I taught at First Nations University for 6 years, and I was head of the Indian art program when she was working there as well. And one of her assignments, Ruth would have her students choose a work of art from the Jansen or Gardner History of Art book, mostly pieces like Van Gogh, Picasso, that sort of thing. And then students would choose colors of beads, sizes of beads, designs, and they were forced to think about beading, but also other issues activated by the making of their works. Judy Anderson was learning to bead, and so she sought out Ruth as well when she was hoping to teach studio art too. And I hired Judy, and she began to bead at First Nations University using some of the assignments that Ruth first used, and then manipulating and adding more. Métis artist Catherine Boyer first learned to bead from Judy and first learned art history from me. And so this went on and on. When Ruth created her beading series between 2008 and 9, she chose the circle format to present the stunning beaded pathogens that infected Indigenous bodies after contact, asserting that beads and disease go hand in hand. This circular format of 11 beaded diseases brought to the New World, and a 12th disease, which I'll talk about in a minute, were used with this sort of transfer lettering to give it sort of a medical look. And the circular view, although it relates to the trivets, the notion symbolically of the circle, it also is the shape when you look through the oculus of an electron microscope. And the relationship to the circle utilizes in commodified works that I showed before, understands a means of resistance to assimilation and genocide, and that's something that Ruth was also thinking about in her work. So Jim Daschuk's Clearing the Plains, Disease, Politics of Starvation, and the Loss of Life that he wrote in 2014 puts into words the visual narrative of cultural genocide that Ruth had beaded as a destructive story of colonialism, but she also sees this as a story of decolonization. She said in the Capilano Review, quote, "I think of the process of budding in which a disease replicates and exhausts the energy of its host cell as analogous to the process of colonization. Beading is different," she said. "It is an activity of survival. It's a means of remembering tradition and of feeling well," end quote. So the visual impact of the diseases in the trading series seductively engages the viewer with the aesthetic beauty of these exquisitely beaded pathogens. But the horrors associated with them melt into a complex undulation of shimmering colors and lines evoked by the technologies inherent in this beading process. Smallpox, as you see here, represents the microscopic surge complicit in the death and destruction throughout Turtle Island. The process of beading this series says much about Cuthand's place on this land, I think, her understanding of colonial past and present, her implicit relationship to resilient cultural epistemologies grounded in the prairies, and the storying power of these works to transform the future. This is syphilis. Syphilis was spread from the Americas back to Europe after contact. So to show the converse spread of that pathogen, Ruth completed the story in porcupine quills, an homage to the technology used widely by Indigenous women on the plains and actually across Turtle Island, using natural dyes and plains plating techniques, a process much slower and much more painstakingly labor-intensive than beading. Ruth symbolically demonstrates the history of beading and the cultural roots of quilling. While her trading series relates to a larger history of the spread of disease, her more recent series, Don't Breathe, Don't Drink, from 2016, considers visual relationships of more contemporary pathogens that plague First Nations in Canada now. After alarming front page news about mold-filled housing, waterborne pathogens on First Nations across Canada, Ruth shifted the way she used beads to call attention to ongoing atrocities. So the installation that you see here that is now in the Art Gallery of Ontario permanent collection includes a blue tarp, because she said she was watching the National at night and seeing scenes of Attawapiskat and mold-filled houses that only had blue tarps holding out the cold winter snow. They could barely stand up to the weather, let alone the wear and tear of a multi-generational family, she said. Beading the emblematic tarp with representational blooms of black mold using matte bead, black beads, mimics the mold blooms in which Cuthan sets a veritable but disquieting banquet of glasses. From afar, she says, the tablecloth and water glasses look beautiful and inviting. But when you get closer, you see something rather ugly, end quote. As with the trading series, Ruth pushes aesthetics into a political realm. The 139 resin-filled glasses and baby bottles contain suspended three-dimensional beaded examples of magnified bacterium and parasites found in the water of 94 communities under a boil water advisory. Cuthan shifts away from traditional methods of beading to create these sculptural three-dimensional forms constructed by glass beads and then set in resin. She repositions confrontational conversations that engage the heavy consequences of colonialism through a hopeful process of beading to enduring traditions. Judy Anderson also has a really unbelievable contemporary practice in beading, and this is her homage to Maria Campbell. And from her Parts of Me Emerge is a project of reciprocity that she's undertaken where she gifts works such as this and many more to people who've been important to her in her life. And she says of Maria, quote, "Maria has played a significant role in my life personally and spiritually." Maria runs a lodge for women in Saskatchewan. And then she goes on to say, "I feel from her I was able to find parts of me that would have remained hidden had she not been in my life," end quote. Resembling the cover of Campbell's 1973 award-winning book, Half-Breed, that was just recently re-released, and the censored part that the editor took out that they forgot to tell Maria Campbell they took out about a rape by an RCMP officer is now in the latest edition. Resembling this cover, we see a mimicking of the iconic original, as if a photographic reproduction. But from between the covers of the book, the pages of this symbolic text emerge as a coyote pelt. And Judy says that, quote, "Coyote is incredibly important for me, and my time spent with Maria helped me to realize this. Like Coyote, who emerges from the book, so do the lessons that Maria teaches." Together, the book the beaded book and the coyote pelt create a three-dimensional sculptural form that fuses traditional and contemporary stories with beadwork, bridging ways of knowing specific to her plains identity. And Judy confirms, quote, "When I think of Maria and the box, I'm going back to the land, to the teachings, to Mother Earth. I feel like Coyote emerges with the help of Maria, and Maria has the help of the land," end quote. Oh, there's another shot of that. Well, Judy has done another series of work, and these are burners that are beaded onto buffalo robes. And Judy's son, Cruz, started out as a graffiti artist when he was about 14, much to her chagrin. And she was seeing his burner around town and having fits and thought, how can I get this kid to get it off the dumpsters and into something more productive? So they started to collaborate together, and Cruz gave his mother permission to use his burner on this buffalo robe, and it is painstakingly beaded here. And she's very much aware in this work of the problems that face young Indigenous men in Canada today, and was trying to help him with that. So it's a very important personal work, but it is one that translates widely. And so we see this particular work here, but she has a series of these, and because they take so long to bead, and the buffalo hide is so thick for a beader to bead through, she does these ones quite slowly, and so she's still working on the rest of the series. And now Catherine Boyer is the youngest person in this group of beaders, and she came to beading fairly late, and so she really felt the impact of both Ruth and Judy on her work. And she said, I'll leave a quote up there for you to read that I put on this particular slide. But this is her work. I met a mermaid on Lake Manitoba in 2016. And you can see, like Ruth, she also uses that circle image, like the trivets, like we see in earlier works on the prairies, that connection to the medicine teachings. But she tells a different story with her beaded designs as a Métis woman. So the circle of blue recalls the moon, the earth. The birch bark canoe connects with Métis history. The mermaid connects with Indigenous narratives, storytelling narratives that were told around the fire. And you see as well, she uses the beads undulating, so you get this active sense of that presence, the active story being told. So I think that we see her representing the Métis worldview of Métis territory that, like Cutthand and Anderson's work, spans space and time and relates to this relational place specifically. This is another work of hers. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to put the name on it. It's called Tracking Trading. And it is beaded onto a rabbit fur. And we see here that she's, again, using the circle, but in this way we have beads fused with rabbit fur to forge a dialogue surrounding relationships between trapping, trade, and culture, both past and present. The work also evokes narratives of balance between male and female aspects of Métis epistemologies. And this delicate work, with its subtle beaded white center on a large rabbit fur ground, includes Boyer's signature style of beading. We've got these complex designs, pathways within the circular space, beaded tracks marked and mapped on a snowy landscape, reference to more than masculine trapping practices, but visually reinforcing community and familial ties to the land. And she understands that her artwork done in beads, she sees them as, quote, a unique access point to our older generations and where their creative opportunities lay, end quote. In and among the rows of painstakingly beaded, sewn beads in Boyer's works lie a re-territorialization of space, a reclamation of land, and an understanding of how land shapes her identities. So Sherry Farrell-Rissette and Kathy Mattis, who you saw in the earlier picture, often have talked about the experience of beading around the kitchen table as a form of theory, kitchen table theory, they call it. And at the hub of many Métis homes, past and present, is the kitchen, and it is a space of dialogic action. The action of making and beading is supported by these often political conversations. But I would argue that this space moves beyond only Métis kitchen settings and not just beading, but sewing and just plain visiting. And it's best done, and it's at its best, it's done by many, many folks, many women around a kitchen table drinking tea. So key to this conversation is the sharing of stories. And I think Catherine Blackburn does a beautiful job in this installation piece from 2017 of combining those elements that celebrate gatherings of makers, a sense of process that brings about so much more than just beading. So Catherine's tea bags with traditional teas inside them have floral beading patterns on the tea bags that were gifted to her from her Dene grandmother. And it's nestled on a fur hide to pay homage to not only the trappers of the land in the north, but the relational connections to an expansive definition of land. So in works such as this, we find links between aesthetics and Indigenous ways of knowing that not only combine storying, but community, reciprocity, and that, of course, intergenerational knowledge transmission. This is a work that she did called, a series called Mother Tongues. And we see here that in the center photo, she has a tongue of her mother, and her 4 siblings are on either side of that. I have a hard time looking at these tongues, honestly, but but I like the symbolism. So she has, obviously she didn't bead on these photographs, but she took, again, the gifted Dene floral designs, and she has put them with Dene syllabics on each of her siblings' tongues, and on her mother's tongue, the mother tongue, we see Dene syllabics done in 24 karat gold beads, which are really, it's quite an amazing piece. Catherine was separated from her family as a young child and is not a Dene speaker, though her mother and 4 other siblings are. And she sees this mother tongue series as a really important move towards her learning Dene and learning the syllabics, and her mother sat with her to help her choose the syllabics for these works. And through that process, she is reconnecting with her family, but also with language, which of course is key to understanding our ways of knowing. So in addition to these works that we've seen, she recently did an exhibition called New Age Warriors, and she tried something very new in this idea. So she's really thinking about futurity here and futuristic visions. So with gear that she designed, not using glass beads, but plastic perler beads, she draws from the past and present to shape notions about a kick-ass future. So does anybody remember perler beads? You'd get these little plastic trays and you'd stick them all together. Well, she's really blown the lid off the perler beads to create these sorts of works here. But she came to that because she says, quote, an extension of my practice, her beading practice, in that it's a way to fuse traditional art practice of beading with contemporary perspectives, end quote. So perler beads connect to Blackburn's vision for a futuristic formulation of Indigenous aesthetics, drawing on that intergenerational knowledge in order to do so. So she's creating functional designs. The outcome of the beading fusion is a form of utilitarian body garb, an armor-like appendage that's strapped to the body, and the work metamorphoses into a formidable metaphors, I think, of transformation, protection, and of course, empowerment. Here we see Carrie Allison's exhibition at the Owens Gallery, in which she really relates to the notion symbolically of kinship. And this is a powerful example of storytelling with relational bonds through beading. So the Heart River, we see these beautiful blue beads flow and meander through like a waterway itself that it suggests, recalling the route that runs through northern Alberta before it empties into the mighty Peace River and flows north to the Arctic Ocean. So perpetually in motion, the heart, like all rivers, cannot be easily contained. The sublime nature of Carrie's undertaking reflects, and she explains, the cultural, quote, life force that supported my ancestors, end quote. And she did this work as an honoring for that place and for that water that is not in the territory she lives today, but connects herself through that. She created this work by sewing, you probably know, thousands of number 8 glass beads in order to reproduce the Google map exactly of the map image and forms performatively that route of over 250 hours alone of beading to create this intimate relationship with the river. So the work amounts, I think, to a powerful visit with the ancestors of Carrie's Cree and Métis family territory and personifies those kinship bonds to the land and to the waterworks. The work was a stitching of herself into her family's land. There's a up close. So she did that onto blue Stroud cloth. I started working with beading way back in 2005. Sherry Farrell-Rissette and I were contacted by the Saskatchewan Arts Board to create a show for Saskatchewan's 100th anniversary. And we brought together works such as this beautiful cradle board that you see here by Marcia Chickeness from North Battleford, Saskatchewan. Most of the works that were used in this show were made by women who had never worked in a gallery setting, had never thought of themselves by artists, but were mostly working on the powwow trail. And we were blown away when we saw this unbelievable example of a cradle board that Marcia Chickeness created. She made this work not to fit her child or her grandchild, but she made it large enough in scale to fit herself into, because she wanted it to heal herself from her residential school experience. And so it is a celebration. You can see that she has amazing beads, but also rhinestones, a sense of bling, again, that idea of adorning yourself for your ancestors and for spirit figures to show your best. And she saw that she could really heal by creating a work such as this. So we began at that time, or I began, of course, Sherry was already working with collections work, but to think about ways that we could push this idea even further. And we are doing that in many ways today, and working with a lot of beaders to create a book on beading pedagogy right now. So Indigenous ways of knowing the land is, of course, steeped in reciprocity and storying, and artists reference stories of making in other ways. Here we see Dana Claxton's work that Emily Falvey mentioned, and this is her storying and making in video. The Sioux Project, Tatanka Oyate, the Buffalo people, was installed at the Mackenzie Art Gallery as an immersive video installation, and she created 4 canvas rounded panels that are encircled and created this image of video taken from the First Nations in Saskatchewan that are Lakota and Dakota. Dana's idea is to reclaim the word Sioux, which is not really mostly a good word, but she's taking it back, and this particular work, the beadwork in this, the makers are really the work sings in this sort of work. But artists reference stories of making in other ways too, and I just wanted to show 2 examples before I'm done. The Land of Enchantment is a very early piece by Woody Crumbo. He's a Kiowa artist, and he painted this in 1946, and he captures the story of making turned commodification that was taking hold in the Four Corners region of the US, but also across Turtle Island. And his insights in this painting are both profoundly funny, but also biting. And of course, I can't leave without mentioning Norval Morrisseau, Anishinaabe Norval Morrisseau. And this particular work is the only one I know that he painted somebody making art. And this is a real homage. He is paying honor to his mother-in-law, Annie Kakagamak, and he uses his visual storytelling language to capture his respect for her prowess as the maker of birch bark baskets. And in fact, you can see that he uses his visual language to show the spirit energy leaving her body and entering that birch bark basket in Northern Ontario. Now, these are Annie's baskets. So there was a donation of this particular painting that came with one of Annie Kakagamak's birch bark baskets. Norval had traded both the works to a United Church minister in the 1970s. We don't actually know exactly when. And the minister's family, when he passed on, gave or donated both of these works to the Royal Ontario Museum. And it's exciting to see that visual conversation, the storying of the relationship between generational creators of art, using first traditional Indigenous media, such as birch bark, to Morrisseau's painting on canvas with acrylics, using colors that mimic the birch bark and the visual language that draws together. This is recent work by Catherine Boyer, and it really just shows how she's taking Métis aesthetics. It's called Hold, Carry the House. And these are her inspiration from tump lines, where Métis, who had to leave quickly from their homes to move on, would take all of their precious commodities, goods, and family items with them. And she's trying to pay honor to that process here. I'm going to end with this slide, Mythologizing Norval, which means all my relations, that really speaks to the depth and power of how we're all connected to the land that we live in, and that the making of an object or an idea involves a relational communion between all living beings, I think, in space and time. And it pulls from the past. We're shaping our present, but let's hope that we can transform this future a little bit. And I think the catalyst of storying can help shape those new directions as we interact together. So thank you for that. Well, first of all, I'm not a beader like these amazing women who are some of the best beaters, I think, in Canada. So it's kind of a strange thing to be around them, beating around a table with these women when my fingers are bleeding and I'm dropping beads all the time. But what it does do is, even if they just give me the job of separating beads into colors, which is sometimes they just work on cleaning up this bag of beads, because they do get frustrated with me. But the act of making and being part of those conversations draws me into ways of thinking about this making process that I love. So I call my beatings doodle beatings. But, I am on that learning road. So yeah, the act of making, for me, even though I find it very intimidating to be in the presence of most of these beaters, I still think that it does give me a sense of understanding those stitches and what goes into the stories of those lines of beads. Oh, that's a really good point. In fact, the Lakota elder that I'm working with will not let what we learn and share together be published in a written form. So that was one of the specific things when I gave her tobacco to work with her on this and she agreed to do it. She said, "You can't write that." So that is pretty weird from an art historical conventional perspective. But I think having a sense of that knowledge will expand the ways I think about storying and that particular dress. And even if it just helps me to understand a little bit more about that part of my own family story, that would be enough for me. Well, I'll just go back to this work then, because I know that Wâhkôhtowin, my great-grandmother's mother, brought her whole family with her to Saskatchewan. She didn't come alone with just her children. And so it is very possible that Wâhkôhtowin is actually a member of our extended family. And the fact that I was so pulled to that dress leads me to believe that. I have to say that doing this research on Morrisseau, which I've been doing since 2005, is often very heavy and hard to carry on just because of forgeries and things like that. But this research, it just is so smooth, it feels so much a part of who I am that I just know that I'm on the right path here. Oh, gee, I've got to stop now. It's time to sing. Well, that's absolutely the case. And one of the reasons for the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was to provide materials to people, was to change the way the education system works so we don't have those gaps. But you know what? Google is really amazing, and you can find pretty good material if you seek it out. So I would say that you don't need to wait around for others to tell you, but there are classes now at all universities on these topics, and so things are changing dramatically than when I was a kid. So I hope that you find some of those stories in other places, and thank you for coming and listening.